I'll be honest, a couple of weeks ago, I was not expecting to be saying this, and certainly not this soon. But I am all the way back in. What's cracking, everybody, and welcome back to Kraken R&R, where the Seattle Kraken win 2-1 in overtime against the Philadelphia Flyers, who, coming into the season, is not a team that I would have been necessarily this excited to be beating, but they have been good to this point, and especially on the road, coming into this game 11-3-4 on the road. But nonetheless, the Kraken battle back from being down one going into the third, and actually for most of the game, through the Philly defense to tie things, send it to overtime, and then win it in the 3-on-3 sudden death overtime. The first time they've been able to do that in now 9 attempts, going all the way back to when they won in the sudden death in Tampa Bay 4-3. And they have won in the shootout since then against the Islanders, but it's been a bit of a rough stretch here for the Kraken in the sudden death overtime, at least when it comes to closing things out. They have forced the shootout a number of times, but yeah, the overtime has been a bit of an issue for them where they were strong last season. Even with that being said, though, this is the first time the Kraken have won a sudden death overtime game at home since Game 4 of the first round against the Avalanche in the playoffs last season. And the first time they've done it at 3-on-3 since almost a year ago on January 19th of last year. Well, same calendar year for a couple more days, but last season. Which, that one, by the way, since I know somebody will be curious, was a 4-3 win over the Devils, with Andrei Burakovsky being the one that scored the overtime winner, just a few games before his injury that would knock him out the rest of the season. Which, as fate would have it, we'll be getting to him here in a second. Now, sure, regardless of what happened in the overtime of this game, the Kraken still would have kept their 8-game point streak going coming out of that 8-game losing streak, but with the win, they battle all the way back to NHL 500 for just the second time this season. The first being the win against the Sharks that came right before that fateful 8-game losing streak where the Kraken went 0-6-2 over 8 games. But they flip it right back around over these last 8 to go 6-0-2, get back to 14-14-9 coming into the new year and the Winter Classic with a fresh slate ahead of them and still very much in the playoff race. Though to be perfectly honest, it is still a bit of an uphill battle for the Kraken to actually make their way into one of those 2 wildcard spots, which is their path to the playoffs. I think the 3 Pacific spots are pretty much locked up at this point. There's still a lot of season left and one of those 3 could fall apart, but I certainly would not count on it, at least enough for it to make a difference with the way that they've been playing. So that leaves the 2 wildcard spots, which are currently being held by Arizona and Nashville. Now, Nashville has been up and down and currently are more on the downtrend, and Arizona has been a surprise to be sure, but who knows how long they can keep it up. Then also ahead of the Kraken, there's the Blues, who, like the Predators, have been up and down and have been kind of starting to struggle a little bit more of late once again. And then, actually tied with the Blues at 37 points, you have the Kraken, who are just 3 points behind the Coyotes for that first wildcard spot, the Coyotes sitting at 40. The problem is the Kraken have played more games than just about everyone else and everybody else in this wildcard race, which unfortunately also includes the 2 teams just behind the Kraken in the standings that have been almost, if not just as hot as the Kraken have been over this last stretch of games. That being the Minnesota Wild, who have won 4 straight themselves and are currently sitting 1 point behind the Kraken, having played 4 fewer games, as well as the Edmonton Oilers, who are sitting 4 points behind the Kraken, having won 3 straight, but have played 5 fewer games. So if those teams continue the pace that they're on over those games they have in hand over the Kraken, they would definitely jump them. So while the Kraken, based on points, are just chasing 3 teams, or I guess 2 to get into the wildcard spot, realistically, they're kind of chasing 3 or 4. At least the good news, though, is that if the Kraken keep playing the way that they have been here over this last stretch of 8 games for the majority of the rest of the season, they should have no trouble staying in this wildcard race and probably even jumping a couple of these teams and find themselves right in the hunt for one of those wildcard spots come the end of the season. And based on how things have been going lately, there's no reason to think that that isn't very, very possible. I mean, sure, they're probably not going to be getting points in the remaining 45 games they play this season, but they have found ways to win games over this last stretch, which was just not something they were doing up till that point in the season. It had taken them at least 4 goals to get a win for that first 30-game stretch, but now here over the last 8, in fact, over the last 4 games, all 4 of these last 4 wins have been wins with 2 or 3 goals. And while yes, it would be nice if they did score a little bit more than 2 or 3 goals a game, it also shows that they've been very good defensively and in net to make sure that that is enough to get those wins. And at least for me anyway, that's why I'm willing to buy back into the idea of this being a playoff team come the end of the season. Because unlike through a lot of those first 30 games, and certainly the 8-game losing streak, where the Kraken were consistently finding ways to lose games, a lot of 1 goal or 1 plus an empty netter or 2 losses in that time, over this last stretch, they've been finding ways to win games really for the first time this season. And that's what playoff teams need to be able to do. Now, yes, if for no other reason than the general heart health of Seattle, it would be nice if they could not play as many 1-goal games, currently 6 1-goal games in a row, the 4 wins and the 2 overtime losses, but it'll come eventually. Or at least I certainly hope so, because between that and these last 2 last-second drive wins for the Seahawks over the last couple of weeks, it's been a nerve-wracking couple of weeks to be a Seattle fan. Happy in the end, but definitely nerve-wracking. And speaking of good news for the Kraken as we get into the rest of the season, or at least hopefully anyway, and more specifically this game against the Flyers, Andrei Burakovsky is back off the IR. That's right, Andrei's back, he's back again. That wasn't the only lineup change though for the Kraken coming into this game out of the one against the Flames. Obviously Burakovsky stepping in for Shore's spot, I think we all saw that coming. Decord also back in net instead of Drieger, which I kind of predicted would be the case in the last R&R. It made sense with the Winter Classic coming up, so every now and then I know what I'm talking about. But then they also put Schultz back in instead of Evans. Now I do kind of think that this signals they'll probably go Schultz in the Winter Classic over Evans, and probably the reason that Evans got that start in Calgary is that it was his return to where he grew up, so that probably did play a role. Personally, I'd like to see Evans in the lineup, and that has nothing to do with what I think about Schultz. I really like Schultz, and, well, obviously he made an impact in this game, but Evans is the future of this team, and honestly, I think has been playing better than Schultz in the time that they've been going back and forth. That having been said, though, I also don't think that the Kraken sitting Evans every other game or a couple games here and there is hurting his development in any way, especially considering that the Kraken have been playing more frequent games than really he's played at any point in his career, likely outside of playoffs in the AHL. They do stick to a pretty similar NHL schedule there. So as long as he's not sitting for long stretches at a time, I don't really think it's anything to worry about, and I really doubt the Kraken would do that. The only reason we saw it with Shane Wright last year is because of the whole situation with him having to go back to the OHL and that whole maze of different rules and stuff that the Kraken had to figure their way around with him. There was a pretty specific scenario. And Hackstall basically said as much after the game tonight, that they do really weigh a lot of those things when it comes to these lineup changes, especially with the younger players, and that's not just him, it's also Ron Francis and the rest of the coaching staff, that they're trying to do what's best for the team, and that doesn't just mean right now game to game, but also for the future, which Evans is definitely a big part of. And of course, it doesn't necessarily have to be Schultz that sits for Evans, it could also be Dumoulin, which they've done before, but the pairing of Dumoulin and Evans did play a little bit better than the pairing of Schultz and Evans, even though I think that was just for 1 game, so not a ton of sample size there. As we do finally get into the game though, it became obvious pretty much right out of the gate what type of game this was going to be, as I do think the Kraken were getting the better of at least the opportunities early on. They just weren't able to connect on very many of them, and anytime they were able to connect on something, the Flyers were doing a good job of blocking those shots. Meanwhile, the other end of the ice, while the Flyers were much better at actually getting shots on net, it really was a game where both teams were locking down the middle of their defensive ends and not allowing much as far as dangerous looks on their net are concerned, or for the Flyers, looks in general, as they were blocking a ton of shots. And as we know, in these types of defensive battles of games, with both goaltenders playing pretty well on top of it, all it can take is one bad defensive mistake, one lucky bounce of a puck, or one seeing eye pass to get through to change the entire course of the game. And that nearly happens 8 minutes in the Flyers' favor, as they get into the Kraken offensive end and quickly get a pass through the entire Kraken defense to the far side of the net, where on the back door there's another Flyers player waiting. He gets the shot off, but Decord is able to dive back, get his glove to it just in time to absolutely rob Philadelphia of the 1-0 lead here early in the game with a spectacular save. I mean, genuinely, look at where Decord is when this guy hits the puck and takes the shot. I don't know how this puck doesn't end up in the net, but he comes up huge for the Kraken here. And then he had to continue to come up big for the Kraken as the Flyers end up on a power play not long after. Which, even though this is a Flyers power play that's currently second worst in the NHL at under 11%, only the Blues have been worse, they still managed to get a couple of pretty decent chances, and Decord had to make a couple of saves and one more pretty nice one. Not quite as nice as that first one, but still, he had to be solid in net for the Kraken. And then continue to be solid in net when the Flyers end up on a breakaway just a couple minutes after the Kraken kill that off at 5-on-5, but Decord makes a huge save on that breakaway to keep things scoreless. But eventually, after all of that, it just turns out to be one defensive, or I guess kind of more offensive mistake too many by the Kraken, as they actually end up on a power play after kind of turning things around after that breakaway a little bit more in their favor. But on the power play, just a few seconds in, Dunn kind of has to poke a puck deep into the offensive end as McCann kind of made a careless pass that was gonna lead to a turnover if Dunn doesn't poke at this puck. Unfortunately, his stab at it goes right to another Flyer, who then turns that into a breakaway, just like if the pass had gone through and been stolen anyway. And to Dunn's credit, who did have to hustle back just to make this a 2-on-1 in the first place rather than a breakaway or even a 2-on-0, he does defend the 2-on-1 pretty well, and Konechny, who had the puck for most of the way in, ends up keeping it and tries to wrap it around Decord as Decord came out a little bit from the net. But just like we saw in Calgary with that goal for Kadri, he isn't quite able to wrap it around the post. However, the puck goes through the crease and off of Dunn's skate on the other side and into the net. So it turns out to be a bit of a two-edged sword that costs the Kraken here. They make the blunder in the offensive end that turns into that odd-man breakaway, and then they get a bad bounce that ends up in their net after they try to defend it well. Still, the Flyers now have a 1-0 lead in a game where good offensive opportunities have been few and far between. And it would stay that way not only through the rest of the first period, which there wasn't a ton left after this Kraken power play comes up empty, aside from giving up the shorthanded goal, but also through the entire second period. The Kraken did get their chances here and there, or chances to have chances. They would get passes through the slot, or maybe even a cross crease pass, but they just weren't able to connect on the other end. And again, the Flyers were doing a pretty good job of limiting even those opportunities for the Kraken, locking down their end of the ice and just suffocating things, especially the Kraken forecheck, preventing them from getting much going in the offensive end. The Kraken were doing the same back the other way, but it just did not mean that there was a lot of offense, and did kind of make you feel like that one goal could be the difference. Thankfully though, almost right away to start the third period, the Kraken come out of the gates getting offensive zone pressure, and some sustained offensive zone pressure for, I think, the first time in the game really. Certainly the best series of shifts they'd had since maybe early on in the first period, if not the entire game. They had a good shift here and there in the second, but it was pretty spotty, and nothing like what they get here early on in the third, which eventually leads to a few pretty good chances. Yamamoto has a wide open net that he just gets a little bit too much of and ends up putting wide of the net back the other way, so the Kraken miss on that one. McCann ends up taking a bad hit and going face down on the ice, which gets no call, but the fans are not very happy about the fact that it didn't have a call. Still, I think it might have led to the call that's made a little bit later, because you kind of knew that with that bad no call on McCann and the fact that the Flyers were already up a power play on the Kraken, the refs were gonna look for something as a makeup. And sure enough, a couple minutes later, I mean, they call it hooking on one of, I think, the fourth liners for the Flyers, but at least in live action and on the replay, I gotta be honest, I did not see much of a hook whatsoever. Either way, the call's made, and the Kraken end up on a power play that they probably should have had a little bit earlier. And on that critical power play here in a third period down one, where you've had a hard time creating offensive opportunities, the Kraken win both faceoffs during this power play. The initial one, which eventually they turn into a shot on goal, that's caught and held by Hart. Then they win the second faceoff, and in the end, it says that the Kraken won 60% of the faceoffs in this game, but I gotta be honest, it seemed like the Flyers were winning almost every faceoff. Either way, the Kraken win both of the ones of this power play. The second one comes right out to Vince Dunn. A one-touch pass from Bjorkstrand to settle it for Dunn. Then he just winds up from the blue line and fires off an absolute laser of a shot right into the back of the net past Hart. It might have gotten touched a little bit by the defenseman on the way by to tip it a bit, but Dunn sees the screen between that defenseman and two Kraken players. It was Yamamoto on one side, and don't remember off the top of my head who, maybe Wenberg, I'd say, is usually up by the net on these power plays, but Yamamoto on one side, who almost touches it himself to get that goal after missing the empty net, but it goes straight in, maybe slightly off the defenseman. Dunn ends up with his 6th of the season, and the Kraken have evened things up here early in the third. And Bjorkstrand ends up with a primary assist for touching the puck a little bit to settle it for Dunn. And then from there, I gotta be honest, the rest of this third period really seemed like two teams outside of the Flyers getting a power play and a few decent chances on that, which again, Decord comes up big for the Kraken, and they do manage to kill off the rest of it. But aside from that Flyers power play, really the rest of this third after the Kraken score, I mean, there's still more shots on goal. The Kraken have some more offensive zone pressure. They get a couple of chances themselves, but it really seemed like two teams playing to not lose at that point. Which, to be fair, if you go to overtime, you're in separate conferences, so there's going to be no wild card implications or no playoff race implications by giving the other team a point. So you just go to overtime and settle it there, which in the end is what ends up happening. And in overtime, the Flyers actually end up starting with the puck, winning the opening faceoff. And then this overtime kind of turns into being a lot less of a, I think structured is the best word for it. Certainly overtime than we're used to seeing the Kraken typically play, where usually when the Kraken end up with possession, which they do pretty quickly here as the Flyers lose the puck along the boards, I think it's Wenberg for the Kraken that ends up taking it from them and getting possession for the Kraken. But we're used to seeing the Kraken then just kind of maintain possession above all else, and sure, they'll get it down to the offensive end and circle around with it, looking for good opportunities, but they will not shoot the puck unless they see a very good chance to score, really prioritizing possession over everything else, which analytically is the best way to play a 3-on-3 with that much open ice. But this time, they did seem a lot more willing to take their chances with shots as long as they could get close to the net. And that did mean that possession changed hands a few times in this overtime for the few minutes that it lasted, one of which meant the Flyers ended up with possession back at the Kraken end, and they very nearly score as a pass that would have been just a tap-in goal doesn't get through thanks to Vince Dunn lifting the stick of the guy that would have been able to shoot it on net. So that puck just kind of harmlessly goes into the corner where the Kraken end up with possession. They get back down to the other end, and it's the trio of Gord, Bjorkstrand, and Schultz that end up in the offensive end. Bjorkstrand takes it up to the net, fires off a shot in close, which Hart's able to make the save, but Bjorkstrand picks up the rebound, skates it around behind the net, up to the blue line where he surveys the situation, and what he sees is a lot of tired Flyers players. Well, 3 tired Flyers players, because that's how many are in overtime. Either way, they are just kind of bunched up in the middle and have lost complete track of Schultz, who's down by the net. Bjorkstrand just fires off a quick pass. Schultz one-touches it, and it slides through Hart and into the back of the net to give the Kraken the overtime winner. Schultz just barely gets this under the pad of Hart, who did get his foot to the post, but I think that him getting his foot to the post almost lifted his pad off the ice, which allowed this puck to slide under him and into the far side of the net, off of the far post, by the way. So this almost just went through the crease and out. But Schultz with the game winner, and the Kraken get that 4th win in a row, that first home overtime win in a long time, and they keep the good times rolling in Seattle into the new year. So for Schultz, it's his 3rd of the season. For Bjorkstrand, his 2nd primary assist of the game. And for the Kraken, who all pig pile in the corner on Schultz, Decord skating down from the other end and jumping onto the pile, which, you know, it's fun to see, but jumping onto the back of Beniers and Dunn with full goalie gear, I mean, it probably won't lead to anything, but oh, what the heck, let him party, have fun with it. Great game from the Kraken, especially Decord, so you know what? He's what got the Kraken to overtime in the first place. I mean, Dunn's goal certainly helped, but Decord huge in net for the Kraken, once again picking up right where he left off going into the Christmas break, and certainly where Drieger left off in that game in Calgary. So the Kraken continue to get fantastic goaltending from both, well, mostly Decord, but also Drieger in that last game. So all in all, a fantastic game from the Kraken. Offensively, I do think they played better offensively than one regulation goal would suggest. They certainly had a lot of opportunities to score, Yamamoto obviously missing the empty net, and a couple of others that I think really would have gotten through and turned into better chances against a team that wasn't playing as suffocating defensively in their end of the ice as the Flyers did in this game. I mean, I can certainly see from a defensive perspective why the Flyers have been as good as they have been so far this season based on how they played in this game, especially considering this was the second half of a back-to-back for the Flyers. That probably played a role in how the Kraken were able to come out in that third period and really control things there for the first few minutes, getting that power play and tying things up. And they certainly played well defensively in their end of the ice on top of that, aside from the breakaway and the odd man rush in the first period, but they really did lock things down in the second and third. So for the Kraken, a fantastic, pretty much 60-minute game, which certainly helps to add to that confidence of what it could mean for the future of this team going on to the rest of the season. They are definitely on a hot streak, and that is a good thing to see as we come into this Winter Classic. Obviously, the marquee event of this regular season, not only for the Kraken, but generally speaking for the NHL, against a very good Vegas team that, although they have been cold of late, did just beat the Kings. So this should be a fun game to watch. Outdoor games do tend to kind of even the playing field a little bit. It's a little bit more, there's a lot more going into the game, a lot more distractions around it, and the ice tends to be a lot different from what players are usually used to. So a lot of factors that tend to mean that these outdoor games can be a little bit differently played than a lot of other ones, and not necessarily play to the strengths or weaknesses of each team the way that a normal game would. Either way, we'll see what happens with that on Monday, but for the Kraken, right now things are going well. They've worked their way back into at least having a chance to keep in this playoff race and this wild card hunt throughout the rest of the season, and that certainly does help make these games a little bit more fun to watch as we go forward. The big picture starting to look brighter for the Kraken over these last 8. And speaking of players that have really helped that, and in this game specifically, let's get to these Kraken 3 stars and close out what has, I think, been a pretty long video. It's certainly taken me a while to record. Either way, these Kraken 3 stars is always being brought to you by the patrons over on Patreon. If you want to help decide the Kraken 3 stars after each and every one of Seattle's games, you can help do that by supporting the channel a little bit more than you already are by watching this point, by going to the link down below to Patreon and supporting there as well. Now, once again, and I mean, it feels like I've been doing this for every game of the last few, but if it keeps being true, I'm going to keep doing it. It's goaltending and Joey Daccord that get the first star in this game. Daccord makes 27 saves on 28 shots, and the one that ends up past him goes off of his defenseman into the net, so it's hard to really blame him too much for that. As far as shots that, well, would have gone in if it wasn't for anybody else being there on the ice, he has a shutout, so I guess there's that. But he just keeps going on with fantastic start after fantastic start in net for the Kraken. Eventually, this is just going to be what we expect from Daccord, but it's certainly a lot of fun whether you expect it or not at this point. And then with the second star, I'm once again going with Vince Dunn, who has been fantastic for the Kraken here of late as well. And yeah, he did have a bit of a shaky first period. He does technically have the turnover that leads to the goal for the Flyers that goes off of his foot on top of that, so not a great sequence of events for him. Even with that being said, though, again, the turnover I think was a little bit more him trying to make up for a McCann mistake on a bad pass, and then he did do pretty well to get back and at least try to defend this, and if it wasn't for an unlucky bounce, he would have been successful. Well, he and Daccord. And then with the third star, I'm going with Oliver Bjorkstrand, the 2 primary assists, but he was all over the ice in this game, creating a lot of offensive opportunities for the Kraken, a handful of shots on goal, and really was just all over the place in both ends of the ice. Some fantastic defensive play from really the entire team. Played really well defensively. Their defensive stats look fantastic after this game. Yeah, Bjorkstrand will be my third, so we'll go Daccord, Dunn, and Bjorkstrand for the 3 in this game. Obviously, it was great to see Burakovsky back on the ice, and he had a couple of nice moments as well, but also a little bit of rust to knock off there. Otherwise, let me know what you think down in the comment section below, who your 3 stars of this game would be, and how we're feeling coming into this Winter Classic, with the Kraken back at NHL 500 with 4 straight wins and 8 straight games with points. That being said, feel free to party it up in the comments section otherwise. And until next time, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, the buttons for that kind of stuff down below to help support the channel. Like and subscribe. Also keeps you coming back for the couple of videos I'll have about the Winter Classic coming up. And until next time, stay safe out there. Be good to each other. God bless and go Kraken!